Okay, let's talk about stuff that apparently nobody's got a clue about. Bigger sensors. Right. You notice one thing too, and this is interesting. This is something that nobody's made mention of. I've said the same thing that the bald dude that kind of looks like me with the long beard, Zach Arias. That guy's got a 100 megapixel medium format phase 1 with a super ginormous sensor in it. And he's got some full frame cameras, and he's got a lot of crop sensor Fujifilm cameras. Oddly enough, him and me, and I know there's some others that I can't think of, say the exact same thing. You know? They're not, you don't see him, I was like, well, the phase 1 is big. Of course he's not packed. Neither him nor me. I'm as happy using crop sensor cameras as I am the medium format Fujifilm GFX. I notice the only people that keep talking about, oh, it needs to have a bigger sensor, are the people that don't own bigger sensor and huge sensor cameras. The people that do, it's like, so what? I'm happy using the DX, I'm happy using full frame, happy using medium format. The people that actually own all those formats are not saying any of this stupid crap about bigger sensors. They just are not. They are not. There's another big YouTuber that crashed my live. Well, he didn't crash it. I mean, he came in. And I got an exact quote since I did a screen grab here. Let's talk about larger sensors and the stuff. There's a quote from someone else before I actually get to that quote. By the way, I used to have a Calumet 4x5. This was one of my black and white 4x5 negatives. This is like from 1992. Yeah, I think it hit the floor. This is a crummy 4x5 shot, by the way. Anyway, this is a 4x5 negative. So let's use this regarding sensors here in a second. By the way, sensors do not work like solar panels and picture windows. You know, a bigger picture window, you open it up, lets in more light. Keywords are more light. Solar panel. The bigger a solar panel is, the more electricity it generates. Well, this is a foregone, absolutely correct statement. Well, guess what? Digital photography does not work that way. The notion, and we're not talking about more light when it comes to exposure. And exposure is always per unit area. No, by the way, this is important. Make sure you remember this fact. There is no light meter out there, and I have the best. I think I've got 8 light meters. There's no light meter on Earth that has an entry for sensor size. None. Never has been, never will be. Why is that? Because exposure is per unit area. Here's a statement I read off the internet, and this is very typical of what people always say. Bigger sensors require less resolving power of the lenses to be sharper. Actually, it's just the opposite. Like any lens, every lens, by the way, crops out a circle of light. If you use like a full frame lens on a crop sensor, the crop sensor is using the center part of that lens, which is always the best part of that lens. Kind of like cutting the crusts off of your bread, right? Full frame sensors are always using more of that circle of projection. Every lens drops a circle. The bigger the sensor, the more of that circle it's using. And the further out it goes, the worse it gets. From every lens on Earth, whether it's a cheap piece of crap made in Russia or a super expensive Leica, Zeiss, Contax, Voigtlander lens, the further you go out to that center of circle of projection, the worse the image gets. Hardcore, 1,000% undeniable fact. So this statement is not only incorrect, it's completely backwards. Larger sensors require greater resolving power, not less. Bigger sensors have higher ISO capability. This is also a big misnomer. The reason why people think this is because it has been typically the case, not anymore due to newer technology like backside illumination, that larger sensors had bigger eyeballs on them. This is a fact. Pixel pitch, I'm just going to say eyeballs, bigger eyeballs. Kind of like, you know, nocturnal animals have those big-ass eyeballs so they can see in the dark. This has been the case for many, many years. And people think, well, this means bigger sensors have better ISO. By the way, ISO is not connected to exposure. ISO is applied gain. If you don't believe me, just look up the words ISO and variance. Bigger sensors have larger eyeballs on them, but that is ending now. Like for example, the Nikon D850 and D500, same pixel pitch, essentially. You actually, 47 megapixels divided by 2.25, you end up with 20 megapixels. Same pixel pitches on the Nikon D500. It is the case now that full-frame sensors are getting the same tiny, smaller eyeballs on them because they have better SNR, signal-to-noise ratio gain, and therefore they have great croppability. So the advantage of more translational information on a smaller sensor is fading away. The larger full-frame sensors are getting the same pixel pitches as the crop sensors have currently, like D7200, D500. Here's another statement that's incorrect. Bigger sensors normally come with higher dynamic range. That's not true. Sony and Samsung make an industrial sensor with 1,000, I don't know if it's 1,000 times, it's easily 100 times better dynamic range than the best medium format or full frame sensor out there. It's a tiny sensor. It's about the size of a Micro Four Thirds. I forget the exact designation of it, but it has super ginormous eyeballs on it and is used for industrial use only. It is only, they make it between a 2 megapixel and a 4 megapixel version, which is like nothing, right? This is a modern sensor. It's an industrial sensor that is used for seeing in basically near total darkness, and one of them actually sees only in infrared. As something is machining something, it's an industrial sensor. The dynamic range on that is absolutely incredible. Sensor size is not relational to dynamic range. It is per unit area. Okay? Let me show you something important with this 4x5 negative, and let's remember the fact that no light meter, can you remember this fact? No light meter on Earth has an input for sensor size. And it also is the case that if you're riding in your convertible car down the road and you go from the big state of New York to the tiny state of Rhode Island, do you know what happens? It's like you just cross over the border, you know, because Rhode Island is a tiny state, right? New York's the big state. Do you know what happens? When you go across that border into Rhode Island, does less light fall on your head? No. Everything remains a constant. That's because per unit area, everything is the same. So here's an exact quote, word for word. And this isn't relational to exposure. Obviously, if you drop more light or more total light on something, we're talking about actual exposure. But this is in regards to sensor size. Exposures per unit area, yes. So if a sensor has more unit areas, as implying a larger sensor, in other words, a larger sensor, if we take a unit area, like say millimeters squared, right? A larger sensor has more millimeters squared. Well, this is true. So now we are talking only about sensor size in this exact quote. So if a sensor has more unit areas, then it gets more light, right? More light in relation to sensor size is incorrect. Once again, no light meter on Earth has an input for sensor size. The light intensity stays the same, correct. The exposure settings stay the same, this is correct. But the total light is more. Total light, quote unquote. We're not talking about more total light as far as exposure. Exposure remains the same. We're talking about a larger sensor versus a smaller sensor here in relationship to the exact quote, if a sensor has more unit areas, as implying a larger sensor. This would be a larger sensor. This is a 4x5 negative from my Calumet 4x5 from 1992 from photography school. This is a pretty large sensor. Now, of course, it's film, it's not sensor. There's no difference, however, when we're talking about the actual premise of what we're discussing here. Compared to 35 millimeter, this is friggin' huge. Does this piece of film get more light in relationship to its area? It does not. More light and total light, not talking about increasing the light for exposure here, where we change our ISO, of course, on this is the film. I think this is 100 speed. We're not talking about the aperture, we're not talking about the shutter. And we're not talking about the actual film ISO. We're talking about sensor size here, or in this case, film size. Same thing. Total light and more light have no relationship to this being larger. Do you know why? And we actually did this as a little art project back in film school days. I'm going to actually cut this up. This is a 4x5. This is pretty huge, isn't it? Wouldn't you like to have a digital camera with a sensor in it this big? Let's cut out something about the size of a 35 millimeter. Okay, around about there. There we go. I've cut it out. You see that? There we go. 4x5 30. Now if I tape this into the back of my 4x5 film tray, my film loading tray, I tape it back there and I don't change my aperture, I don't change my shutter, and obviously the film speed remains the same, of course. What happens? Everything remains exactly the same. The only difference is this versus this, right? That's correct. Total light and quote-unquote more light have no connection regarding sensor size, or in this case film size, in relationship to either film photography or digital photography. Digital photography is per unit area. No digital sensor on this earth works like a picture window and no digital camera on this earth works like a solar cell. Well, more solar cell, more power. More better! More better! Say after me. Repeat after me. Go, more better! Bigger is better. Bigger is only bigger. Yeah, right. Bigger. No, a bigger sensor does not, or in this case film, doesn't make any difference. Bigger sensors do not gather more light. Let me repeat that. This is not my opinion. Don't try to correct me. You go ahead and try to correct me, actually, if you want to. Bigger sensors do not gather more light. And when I've actually said this in the past, people go to me, sure it does, it's bigger. You know, of course it gathers more light. Film and sensors do not work like picture windows. You open the blinds up bigger, you know, the drapes, like, there's more light pouring in the room. Think about that a second. Room is one thing. We're talking about silver halide crystals or photosites. We're talking about millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of little spots. Let me point something else out to you here. If I actually only drop enough light to cover the center of this piece of film or sensor up right here, what does it have to do if I actually open up the projection, the circular projection, to cover the entire piece? What changes here in the center? Nothing. Exposure is per unit area. Total light and more light, total light and more light, are not connected. I'm not talking about exposure where we're actually increasing the light to the sensor of the film. Is not connected to digital photography nor film photography. You see, the light that this, like, let's say I'm going to shoot a scene where it's dark over here and it's really bright up here, right? This little piece of film or this little piece of sensor does not give a crap about the light that's going on up here. Whatever this gets down here is what it gets. If you drop more light up here, what happens down here? Nothing. I'm going to open up some light up here, yeah, because what happens? Nothing happens down there. People keep telling me that. I said, you know, bigger sensors don't gather more light. And they're like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. Sure they do. If it's bigger sensor, of course it's gathering more light. More total light, too. They'll actually say that. Sensors don't work that way. It's per unit area. If bigger sensors gathered more light, if bigger sensors gathered more total light, then A, light meters would have an entry for sensor size, and B, when you drove from the state of New York, which is huge, to the state of Rhode Island, which is small, something would happen to the amount of light falling, and it doesn't. Nothing changes. We cannot say total light or more light in regards to digital photography. It does not work that way. Exposure doesn't change. If I change the sensor size, in this case the film, I could cut this in half. It's like, well, this is my 4x5 camera. It's like, yeah, but I want to put a 2 by 2.5 inch piece of film in the back and tape it back there. What's going to change on my exposure? My dynamic range. Your dynamic range won't change. Your exposure won't change. And the amount of total light is irrelevant. It makes no difference. The correct exposure is the correct exposure. Per unit area literally means per unit of area. And one area has no bearing on another area. You understand that too? One area of a sensor or film has no bearing on the other area. Or the adjoining area. Less than a few microns beside it. One photo site here and another photo site just a few microns away. More light here has no bearing on this photo site over here. When you open up the window onto your living room is one thing. If we were to have a correct analogy regarding digital photography, we'd talk about opening up the picture window on a bazillion little living rooms. That would be increasing exposure in total, because your aperture obviously increases the total amount of light falling on each unit area. But when we say unit area, we're talking about millions and millions of little unit areas as far as the amount of megapixels that are on the sensor or the amount of grain that's actually on the camera, on the film itself. I actually cut up my 4x5 here, but it was a crappy picture anyway. So no, this total light and more light stuff does not fly. It has no connection to digital photography. And if you have a problem with that, I suggest you call up Sekonic. the makers of the best light meters on Earth, and says, "Hello, cello, Sekonic, yeah, got a question for you. How come you don't have an input on your light meters for sensor size?" And Sekonic dude is going to tell you, "Are you smoking crack? Exposures per unit area. Sensor size has no bearing." Because sensors don't work like picture windows and solar cells, girlfriend. Bye.